Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 904B, and today's date is February 26, 2016, and the title of the episode is the U.S. and the coalition forces preparing to use tactical nukes in Syria? Let's get into the economic collapse, political, and geopolitical news. Now, out in North Korea, we understand that the U.S. is using this hydrogen bomb detonation to basically bring in military assets into South Korea. South Korea is using it to up their budget, and the U.S. is using it to provoke North Korea. Because the players are always the same. It's North Korea, it's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, it's Syria, BRIC nations. And right now, we know that Obama signed sanctions. The U.S.-sponsored UN Security Council's draft resolution for toughening sanctions against North Korea is being looked at by Russia. They want to read the fine print to see what it actually says, and they're going to analyze it, and they're going to come up with a decision if they should veto it or approve it and place new sanctions on North Korea, and we'll follow that to see what happens there. We see that the U.S. is bringing in more troops into Nigeria. Now remember this, the U.S. wanted to get into Nigeria, and we know that the previous president of Nigeria was voted out of office. New president was voted in. And finally, the U.S. had the ability to get into Nigeria because the previous president was giving the U.S. a very tough time. Basically, the U.S. wants to garrison Nigeria. They're using Boko Haram, this terrorist organization, as an excuse to bring in troops. And originally, they said, we're going to bring in troops, and they're only going to be there for training. Now, the troops are going to be redeployed. They're going to be moved to the front lines in the war against Boko Haram. And they'll be close to the fighting, but they're not in combat roles. Didn't we hear this before? In Iraq, in Syria, in Ukraine, when we saw video evidence that there were U.S. soldiers there fighting. So they keep, and they are continually telling us these stories, but we know what's happening here. They're basically invading all of these countries and placing soldiers in the country to garrison the country and to keep the country locked into terror, thinking that the government needs the U.S. And most of the time, they're fighting against the people who don't like the puppet government. And we see this happen a lot. We see it all throughout the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in many of the countries in Africa. Now, the EU, because of this refugee crisis, it's getting worse and worse as we continue down into this year. Solberg is preparing to turn everyone away and go into lockdown mode in Norway, and basically saying that this whole thing is getting out of hand. Already 7 European states have reinstated border controls. The Schengen free travel zone is kind of out the window right now. This is putting a huge strain on Greece, and the whole thing is really starting to fall apart right now. And it looks like the EU might completely break down in 10 days. And it will head into anarchy. And we're going to have to watch that very, very closely. You know, out in Ukraine, Poroshenko signed a law on the ratification of an agreement with NATO on founding a diplomatic mission in Ukraine. The agreement foresees the founding of NATO Representation Office in Ukraine that will consist of NATO Communications Office, NATO Center for Information and Documentation. The new diplomatic organ and its personnel receive privileges like immunity, cooperation given to diplomatic missions in accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961. And we see that NATO and Ukraine are moving closer and closer, right on the doorstep of Russia. And we see that they're doing whatever they possibly can to gin up this next offensive. Already, as we know, DHS was in Ukraine looking at the power outage in Ukraine, where 225,000 customers lost their power. And of course, they said, yes, this was a cyber attack. Yes, it was from Russia. DHS was brought in there to confirm all of this. And what's very interesting about all of this, they're saying it's from a Russian hacking group, Sandworm, and we discussed this in previous reports. But when DHS was in Ukraine, do you know they looked at no evidence whatsoever? All they did to make their assessment, they interviewed 6 Ukrainian organizations affected by the blackout. And investigators were not able to independently review technical evidence. And they came up with the conclusion that this cyber attack was caused by the Russian hacking group. This is not an investigation. They didn't do anything. All they did was say, yes, we believe what you're saying. It came from this area. And you can see what they're doing right now. They're continually pushing the idea that Russia is attacking Ukraine. Well, they need this to continually show up in the corporate media. They need this out there because they need to make the case of why they're going to be going back into the southeastern area. Now, Obama is talking with U.S. military officials about Libya, about ground troops, about how they should go in and fight the Islamic State, which we know this is not what they're doing, because we know the Islamic State was airlifted from Syria by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, by the U.S. into Libya. At the same time, Russia was bombing. This is when we saw the buildup in Libya. And we know they're trying to get this unity government in place because they need to be invited in. So the world looks at this and says, no, they were invited in. They have our permission. But we know that France, we know that the U.S., they're already in Libya, and they're running covert ops inside of Libya. Right now, the report says that France has about 180 special op teams in Libya right now. And of course, the news broke that they did, and we can see that there are other coalition forces that are already in Libya. They already have a plan. They're all ready to go. Like I said, they're just waiting for that green light. Now, a drone crashed into Turkey near the Syrian border. The drone is unidentified, and they're not really clear which nation was operating the unmanned drone. And I'm sure that Turkey would love to blame this on Syria, but we'll have to see if this goes anywhere or the story just completely disappears because the false flag didn't work out the way they wanted it to work out. Now, Russia has parliamentary polls, elections coming up in September, and Putin is out there warning that foreign enemies are preparing themselves for these elections, adding that the security services must be ready to prevent any outside interference in the elections. And they recently passed a foreign agents law, basically making it illegal for Russian political parties to receive sponsorship from or enter into business deals with NGOs that have foreign agent status. And maybe we should have something like that here in the U.S. because we probably should ban lobbyists. We should probably ban corporations from donating to certain parties. We should probably ban other foreign governments coming in and supporting different candidates. Actually, most likely, we should put all the candidates on an even playing field and say, this is your allotment. And you know what? You're going to have to succeed on what you're going to do for the people. Period. That's it. No more donations. No more special interest groups. None of this. Now, the U.S., out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, they launched an ICBM, a nuclear ICBM. Of course, there was no nuclear warheads on this one. But this is the second time this week they did this. Now, they did the first one 7 days ago, and they decided to do another one. The question is, are they just testing, or are they sending a message? Well, they're sending a message. It landed about a half hour later. It flew about 4,200 miles, and it came down near the Marshall Islands of the South Pacific. Now, instead of passing this off as another routine test, the Deputy Defense Secretary, Robert Work, who witnessed the launch, said the U.S. tests conducted at least 15 times since 2011 send a message to strategic rivals like Russia, China, North Korea. If you notice, all the players are the same. That Washington has an effective nuclear arsenal. And he said, that's why we do this. Really? What it's saying is that the U.S. is prepared to use nuclear weapons to defend the country, or if they're losing the war. Because the U.S., when all else fails, they will turn to their nuclear arsenal, and they will use the nuclear weapons. And what's very interesting about all of this is that Obama, if you remember going back in time here, when he was at first in office, he won that Nobel Peace Prize because his plan was to reduce U.S. dependence on atomic weapons. Obama called for a world eventually free of nuclear arms in a speech in Prague, and later reached a new strategic weapons treaty with Russia. He received the Nobel Peace Prize for this, on his stance on reducing atomic arms. Now, he boosts the spending for nuclear weapons. And the U.S. is sending messages to the world that we will use nuclear weapons if you don't do what we say. We're reaching the next level here. This reminds me of two apes who are getting ready to battle, and each one has a stick, and they're pounding it on the ground and throwing rocks to show, listen, if you come over to this area, this is what's going to happen to you. It feels like this is what the U.S. is doing right now. The U.S. is banging sticks, throwing rocks, getting ready for battle. Now, out in Syria, we know we have this ceasefire agreement. And, of course, the U.S. is out there saying that they don't think the ceasefire is going to work out. They don't think that Russia's going to adhere to the ceasefire. They're going to break it eventually, which makes no sense why they would do this at this point. They're winning against the Islamic State. They're pushing the Islamic State further and further east. They're liberating cities, towns. They're destroying the supply routes. They're exposing Turkey and their oil smuggling operation. They're showing that Turkey and the U.S. are funding the Islamic State and arming the Islamic State. Why would they want to get rid of the ceasefire? Because their battle with the Islamic State and all the other terrorist groups is continuing. Who cares about the opposition? It's meaningless. Think about why they have a ceasefire with the opposition. Because they can get rid of the Islamic State and the other terrorist groups, and this foreign-controlled opposition, which is paid for by the U.S., which is paid mercenaries, it stops them from removing Assad. Actually, it was a brilliant move. And right now, we see the U.S. draft resolution in the UNSC, and they're hoping to basically get this passed, and it's being circulated around the UN Security Council for this time period for February 27th. But Obama is out there and warns Damascus and Moscow that the world will be watching the ceasefire. So Obama, once again, renewed his call for President Assad to step down and he said there is no alternative to his removal. He also called on Russia and the Syrian government to honor a negotiated ceasefire in Syria, saying that the world will be watching. For the Nobel Peace Prize winner, he should be saying, we're going to do everything in our power to make this work. We don't want war. We're going to work with Russia. Assad can stay. The people have the choice of voting them in power or out of power. But basically, it sounds like he's giving ultimatums. And this is what the U.S. normally does. It's black or white. Either you do this or else. And this is what we're seeing. Now, Assad's advisor, Shaban, said something very interesting. That the moderate rebels are the only opposition in the world who are agents of foreign countries. So they know exactly what's going on here. They know they're paid mercenaries. They know they're supported by Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the US, UK, and the rest of the coalition forces. And all of this is being ginned up for one purpose and one purpose only, is to remove Assad, put a central bank into this country, put the dollar on their natural resources, and build a pipeline, and then eventually go into Iran. So we see right now Russia, Syria, they know exactly what's going on here. We see the Obama administration, they're holding internal discussions on military options if the ceasefire fails. And they're continually telling us that it's going to fail because they already have another plan in the works. Now remember, all their plans, they just don't work out. A lot of them don't work, just like back in 2013 with the sarin gas, when the U.S. brought all the ships into the Mediterranean. They were getting ready to go into Syria, and basically the whole plan fell apart. Russia stepped in. They made a deal with the U.S. saying, listen, if Assad gets rid of his chemical weapons, are you satisfied with this deal? Because the U.S. at that point and the world said, wait, what are you doing here? You have no proof. And the U.S. couldn't get any traction in Congress to go to war. And this is why they backed down at that time. But he's looking and discussing no-fly zones, safe zones for the refugees, splitting up Syria. We see all this coming about right now. Now we see the Syrian army, the 103rd Brigade of the Republican Guard. They've concentrated their efforts on recapturing the border crossings into both Turkey and Idlib. And in a matter of weeks, the 103rd Brigade was advancing towards the primary rebel stronghold in Latakia, capturing every hilltop and village in sight. The U.S. now is flying in humanitarian aid, and we see that some of the humanitarian aid from the UN World Food Program accidentally landed in the Islamic State controlled territory of Deir ez-Zor. Now, haven't we seen this in the past, where we've seen humanitarian aid, weapons, by accident land in the territories that are controlled by the Islamic State? We've seen this time and time again. It is no accident. They're resupplying their proxy armies. They're giving them humanitarian aid. They're giving them weapons. They're preparing for what's coming next. And out of Veterans Today, we see that there's more information coming out of what's happening in this area. They've gotten intel, and it says that the U.S. is involved with Saudi Arabia and Turkey for other military plans, other than Plan B. And they're saying, as you know, Saudi fighters arrived in Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, a base that they share with the U.S., and they're saying that Saudi Arabia, they brought in tactical nuclear weapons into the base right now. And they're planning to use these tactical nukes in Aleppo. And we have confirmation right now that Turkish intelligence delivered one tactical nuclear weapon to the city of Aleppo. So what are we seeing right now? Now remember, a couple reports back, Lebanon was being evacuated of citizens of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. Diplomats are leaving, and there's a travel warning all in this area. Now remember where Lebanon is located. It's located on the west side of Syria, close to Israel, moving up the west side of Syria. On the east side of Syria, we have Iraq, and to the north, we have Turkey. It looks like they are planning to come in from the west, come in from the north, and come in from the east with this new plan. And it looks like they're planning to have this major offensive. And we need to look at some type of an event that they're going to push forward. And we see them bringing in a tactical nuke into Aleppo, would start the fighting once again, would create a problem in this area because we know that the Syrian armed forces have liberated most of Aleppo. It would open up this entire area, and we are heading down a path. If this does happen, we are going to see all-out war. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.